Thank you, everyone, for being here. So today's speaker is Sivaram. So he's a fifth-year PhD student from University of Southern California, and his research focus on developing and improving internet security and also network measurements. And today's talk is about how can we create and improve block lists of IP addresses. So thank you, Sivaram.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Yeah, I hope everybody could see my screen right now.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. Great, again, thanks for the introduction, and I'm honored to be here to present our work. Just before that, I'm just going to pause the video. So, okay, great. Today I'll be presenting our work on IP Blocklists. So particularly I'll be presenting two works, which looks into improving the accuracy of block lists and also how reused address in block lists could be problematic and how we could actually detect them. So these two works are in collaboration with my advisors, Milan Yu and Elena Mokovic, and a couple of folks from ICSI, including Anusha and Sadia. So what are IP block lists? So IP block lists contain a list of malicious IP addresses that are known to be bad. A typical example of an IP block list is shown in the slides, where it consists of a list of IP addresses that are bad. And IP block lists are commonly used to typically aid more sophisticated defense systems such as spam filters or intrusion detection system. The key idea about IP block lists, which makes it very attractive, is that it's very simple to use. So if you're a victim network and you're under a large, novel, volumetric attack, IP block lists are the most simplest to use because all that the network operator needs to do is that they need to check the incoming traffic, take the IP address of the incoming traffic and verify with the block list. If it's present in the block list, they could just drop the traffic. So this makes it very attractive, and there are several maintainers who maintain malicious IP addresses. And some of those maintainers include Alienwall, Project Honeypot, or Malwarebytes. However, IP block lists have problems in them. The first problem is that they often contain fragmented information. This is because they mainly focus on a single type of attack, say capturing all the spam IP addresses, and also they have very limited vantage points. So for any block list, they wouldn't capture all the malicious attackers. And even if they focus on a particular malicious activity, they need not capture all the spammers or IP addresses that are hosting malware. This is because they don't have a lot of vantage points. The second problem is that IP block lists do contain malicious activity that's a snapshot in time. However, there are malicious actors who are smart and they would evade blacklisting by staying dormant for some time, and they would often reappear in the same IP block list over and over again. So this becomes a problem as well. The third problem is that IP block lists are reactive because most of these maintainers would list the IP addresses when they see a symptom of malicious activity from them. So they only react to an attack, but they are not proactive in capturing these attackers. Finally, block lists contain IP addresses, and because of IPv4 address shortage, what could happen is that IP addresses could be reused, and if these reused IP addresses are blocked, they could block more number of users than needed. So let's look into these problems in more detail and understand them. So the first problem being the fragmented information. In the next few slides, I would be depicting the block list as the big circles. And if a particular block list is successful in identifying an attacker, it's marked in red. So what we see over here is that block lists miss many attacks because they often monitor only a specific type of attack. And this has been observed in many research where they have seen different types of block lists and see whether they're capable of detecting attackers. And they often found that they are not that great in detecting attacks. And over here, we could actually see it because the reason why they don't detect is because they focus on specific attacks and they do not focus on the general badness of the entire IP address. However, it is also known that compromised machines are constantly reused for initiating different types of attack over time. So if there is an IP address that sent you spam today, about 3 months later, they could send a DDoS attack. So monitoring different blocklist types could be helpful in capturing attackers more proactively. So a possible solution is that you could actually combine block lists of different attack types, and you could actually hope to capture more number of attackers. So let's look into the second problem. Here we see that historical blocklist data could actually be useful because there is a repeating pattern of attackers coming in and going out of blocklists. So if you were to monitor the snapshots of blocklists over time, and if you were to include all the historically listed IP addresses in these blocklists, we could potentially capture these reoffending IP addresses to improve them. However, we need to do this very carefully because blocklists have false positives. In these examples, if a blocklist has a false positive or a misclassification, it's marked in green. And blocklists typically have false positives because they're usually maintained by different organizations or individuals, and they have their own proprietary algorithms to include an IP address in a block list. So it's up to them to decide whether this IP address is malicious or not. So because there can be some problems with their proprietary algorithm, they may list these legitimate addresses. So if we consider this idea of aggregating block lists of different attack types, what we could do is that we could actually potentially amplify the total number of misclassifications because each individual block list would have their own misclassification. And to make matters worse, if we were to consider all the historical snapshots of the block list and combine them, we're going to amplify the misclassifications even more. So a goal of a new block listing aggregation technique should be in such a way that we are able to aggregate this historical block list and somehow reduce this misclassifications in them. The third problem is that block lists are often reactive because they list IP addresses. Now, it is also known that poorly mismanaged networks harbor more number of malicious activities than well-managed networks. So if you were to represent the IP addresses in terms of an IP prefix, say the /24 representation of an IP address, we could potentially capture more number of attackers who are harboring within the same network. However, this needs to be done carefully again, because if you were to expand all the IP address to their IP prefix, what could happen is that you could again amplify the total number of misclassification. So the goal, our second goal should be the fact that we should selectively expand some of the addresses into IP prefixes in such a way that we do not cause misclassification. Finally, the problem with IP address is that because of IPv4 shortage, there are reused addresses. Particularly, we'll be looking into two forms of address reuse, which is natting and dynamic addressing. Now let's take an example how natting of IPv4 addresses could be a problem in blocklisting IP addresses. Here, there's this user who's trying to access a website hosted by Cloudflare. And this example is actually taken from the Cloudflare community, where this user is posting this complaint. When the user is accessing the website using an IP address IP, they actually find that they're being blocked by the dshield block list, which is used by Cloudflare. On investigating further, the user actually finds that their IP address is indeed shared by many other users at the same time. And one of the user is actually running a spam campaign, uh, actually leading to the IP address which is shared by all these users to be blocked. So in order to improve blocklisting, what we need to do is that we need to accurately identify natted reused addresses so that we prevent unjust blocking of other users who are not malicious. The second case of reused addresses comes in dynamic addressing, and let's take this example to see how it could be problematic. Here we have two users, A and B, who are allocated IP address IPA and IPB. Now, let's say that IPA is malicious and they get blocklisted, therefore they're cut out from the internet. Now, due to the changing network policies, what could happen is that their IP addresses could be reallocated due to dynamic addressing. Now, let's assume that these two users' IP address gets interchanged. That is, the user B gets the IP address of IP A. Now, if IPA is present in any of the block lists, what could happen is that user B is going to get blocked instead of user A. So here, what is happening is that there's more number of users who are being blocked because of an IP address. So we need to accurately identify dynamically reused addresses in block lists, again, to prevent unjust blocking of users. So revisiting all our problems, I'll be talking about two of our research work which deals with these problems. For the first three problems, we propose BLAG, which uses a technique of aggregation, and it uses a recommendation system to estimate the misclassifications in the aggregated block list. And it also selectively expands some of the IP addresses into IP prefixes. This work was presented at NDSS this year. For the fourth problem, we propose two new techniques to identify natted and dynamically allocated reuse addresses in block lists. And we see how we could help in identifying these IP addresses to prevent unjust blocking. This work was presented at IMC this year. So the rest of my talk is divided as follows, where I will be presenting BLAG, which deals with improving the accuracy of block lists. And we'll talk about the data sets and the evaluations of BLAG. Then I'll move on to the second part of my talk, where we propose two new techniques of identifying reused addresses. And I'll also talk about some results there. So how does BLAG work? BLAG first performs, the first step of BLAG is the aggregation phase, where it aggregates over 157 block lists of different attack types. Then BLAG estimates the misclassification by using a sample of the inbound traffic to the network and uses a recommendation system to prune out these misclassifications. Finally, BLAG selectively expands some of the IP addresses into IP prefixes to improve performance. So let's look into these individual steps one by one. We have seen earlier that historical blocklist data could be actually useful. However, what can happen is that if we were to include all these historically listed IP addresses, we could actually increase the misclassification. The main reason is that some of the IP addresses that were malicious in the past need not be malicious at a current time. This is because these IP addresses may be cleaned or be scrutinized of the malicious activity, and they can no longer be malicious. And this observation was also observed by Presta, which is a work presented at EXAC, where they show that recently listed IP addresses in block lists have a higher tendency of being malicious than IP addresses that were listed way back in the past. So in order to capture this, BLAG presents something known as a relevance score, which is the same score which is presented by Presta to assign to assign a particular score to determine when the IP address was listed in a block list. So the relevance score is structured in such a way that recently listed addresses would have a higher score. So this is a formulation of a relevance score for an IP address A listed in a block list B. Here, T is a current time, T out is the last time when the address A was listed in block list B, and L is a constant which ensures that the score decays over time. So in a nutshell, this formulation ensures that a high relevance score means that the IP address was recently listed in a block list. And if the score is low, it was listed way back in the past. So once the aggregation of block lists is done, the BLAG uses a recommendation system to identify misclassification. So recommendation systems are commonly found in popular services such as Netflix, Amazon, or YouTube to provide better recommendations to users on movies or books. Now, this is really useful for these companies because it helps in increasing the revenue because the user tends to watch the content more or the user tends to buy more products. Now, these recommendations are based on the user's previous ratings on books or movies. And what the recommendation system does is that it tries to find other similar users who have the same taste. so that they could recommend better products to them. Now, let's take a simple example of a recommendation system to understand how it works. Here, we have 6 users and 6 books. And if a user has rated a book, they would rate at a scale of 0 to 1, where 0 indicates that they really dislike the book, and 1 indicates that they really like the book. So, for example, if we take the last user, we see that they really like green books because they have rated it pretty high. On the other hand, they do not like yellow books because they have rated it pretty low. Now, a service such as Amazon would be interested to see if it's worth recommending the green book to user 1. This is because if they actually they would want to show books that they would likely buy. So therefore, they would want to use a recommendation system to see what would be the potential rating of this user for this book if they actually read this particular book. So by running the recommendation system, we see that the user one would potentially rate the green book as 0.7. Now let's try to understand how this number came by. We could see that user 1 and user 3 are similar. That is, they have a similar taste in books. We see that they have actually rated the blue books exactly the same. So it is very likely that they would also like the green book or rate the green book to the same extent. So that's a reason why we see that the recommendation system has given the user 1 with a score of 0.7, which is very close to 0.6. Now, BLAG actually uses a recommendation system to identify misclassifications in block lists. At first, BLAG arranges the IP addresses and the block list in the form of a matrix where where the IP addresses are in the rows and the block lists are in the column. And the relevance score, which was calculated a few slides ago, is filled in if a particular IP address is present in a particular block list. Now, then what BLAG does is that it adds a new blacklist known as the misclassification blocklist. Now, the key point about the misclassification blocklist is that it contains only misclassifications. Now, in this example, let's consider that these 3 IP addresses are actually legitimate, and therefore they constitute the misclassification blocklist. Now, for every network, this misclassification blocklist would be curated from a sample of their legitimate traffic. Therefore, BLAG is curated for every single network. Now, in this example, we see that the last 3 IP addresses have been allocated a relevance score of 1, indicating that they are actually listed in misclassification blocklist and they are false positives. Now, the goal is that we need to find the relevant score for the remaining addresses in the misclassification block list. And the intuition is that if the IP address were to be present in the misclassification block list, they would have a very high score. And if they have a very high score, it means that these IP addresses are indeed misclassifications. So if you were to run the recommendation system, we see that IP1 and IP2 are pretty similar. This is because IP1 and IP2 are listed in block list 3, and they have very similar relevance score of 0.8 and 1. Now, the recommendation system captures the similarity of misclassified addresses and gives a high score of 0.7 to IP1. So therefore, IP1 is likely to be a misclassification based on the recommendation system. Then BLAG goes ahead and sets a threshold for every network and prunes out all the misclassifications which have been recommended. So in this example, out of the 8 addresses, 4 addresses have been pruned out because the threshold is set to 0.7, and 4 addresses have a threshold greater than 0.7. Now, why does this recommendation system work in this scenario? So given the scenario of all the IP addresses which are allocated to user, we could never know which IP address is malicious and which is legitimate at any given point in time. Moreover, there are several features or factors that actually influence a particular IP address to be misclassification. And one of the examples which I covered earlier was that some of the blocklist maintainers have proprietary algorithms by which they decide which IP address should be legitimate and which IP address should be malicious. And this proprietary algorithm is unknown to us, and therefore we don't know what constitutes an IP address to be a misclassification. Now, what the recommendation system does is that it helps us to identify addresses that share the same features as that of a misclassification. And it looks into the listing patterns of block lists and other known misclassified IP addresses and determines which IP addresses could be potentially a misclassification. Now, once a threshold has been set and the IP addresses have been pruned out, BLAG goes ahead to selectively expand some of the IP addresses into their IP prefixes. And it does so by two checks. In the first check, what BLAG does is that it checks if a particular prefix has any known misclassification in the same /24 address space. In this example, among the known misclassifications of these three IP addresses, we do not see any other IP addresses in the same /24. So therefore, all the IP addresses pass check 1. For check 2, BLAG checks if any of these addresses are in the same /24 prefix as the likely misclassification. So in this example, we see IP1 and IP3 are present in the same /24, and therefore BLAG, this particular IP address fails the check number 2, and BLAG chooses not to expand this IP address into its IP prefix. So finally, what BLAG does is it expands all the IP addresses that could be expanded into its /24 and leaves behind IP addresses which fails either one of the checks. So that's how BLAG works in these three steps. And now let's look into the data sets which were used to evaluate the performance of BLAG. So we monitored about 157 block lists from the duration of Jan 2016 to December 2017. And these block lists covered different attack types, and we have broadly categorized them into 4 categories. That is malware, reputation, spam, and attack, basically indicating that malware block lists list IP addresses that either host malware. Reputation block lists have IP addresses that are known to be have poor reputation, and spam and attack block lists pretty much send spam or a DDoS attack from those particular IP addresses. And during this period, we observed about 176 million IP addresses that were listed across 157 blacklists. So in order to evaluate BLAG, we also need a source of ground truth. So in the paper, we have 3 different types of ground truth for different types of attacks. But in this talk, I will only be talking about the email data set. However, you could look into the paper to understand the performance of the other 2 data sets. So for each type of data set, we maintain the legitimate portion to evaluate how effective BLAG is in recognizing misclassification. And we also have the attack portion to determine how effective BLAG is in capturing these attackers. So for the email data set, we have the spam mails from Mailnator, and we have legitimate emails from an IRB study which we conducted. So let's see how we use the email data set to train our system and also to evaluate our system. So we use the first 7 days of the data set for training. Basically, this forms the known misclassification that is used to form the misclassification block list. Then we use the next 7 days to estimate the threshold. In the example which I showed earlier, the threshold was set to 0.7, and this could vary for different networks. So we use the next 7 days to estimate the right threshold for maximum attack detection and minimum misclassification. And the remaining 16 days, we actually use it to evaluate the performance. So for the legitimate addresses, we conducted an IRB study where we recruited volunteers who gave access to their Gmail. And all that we did was that we created a plugin which only captured the IP addresses of the senders, and we did not collect any other identifiable information. And for spam emails, we used a service called Mailinator. So basically, Mailinator is an open mailbox, and anybody could just send mails to this open inbox. So we got hold of their API and scraped through multiple inboxes and filtered out the spam emails to identify IP addresses that actually sent the spam. So let's look into the evaluation. So in order to capture the accuracy of BLAG, we compare with three competing approaches. So the first competing approach is the best approach, where we identify the single best performing block list for any given data set. Note that this is a hypothetical situation because a network operator would not know which block list would actually perform best under a given situation. The second approach is the historical approach, where we combine all the block lists and all the IP addresses that were listed across our monitoring period. So this is the naive aggregation stage, where we propose that if we were to naively aggregate, there would be a lot of misclassifications. The third approach is the Presta approach, which was presented at EXAC. Basically, their technique uses a spatial and temporal analysis to improve spam detection of IP block lists. And finally, we measure the accuracy of block lists in terms of specificity and recall. And if the specificity is high and if the recall is high, it means that the performance of the particular block list is also high. So we find that the best block lists have very high specificity, that is greater than 99%, but they have very poor recall. That is, a single individual best performing block list is not good enough to capture all the attackers. When we move ahead with the historical block list, that's the combination of all different types of block lists, we find that the recall actually improves to 18%. That is, we are able to detect more number of attackers. However, we take a hit in the specificity because there are more number of misclassification. And for the email data set, the specificity drops to about 88%. When we actually compare these two approaches with BLAG, what we see is that the recall dramatically improves to about 65%. And BLAG is able to maintain the high specificity level because it's able to correctly identify the misclassification. So we see that the specificity is about 95%, which is much better than historical. And the attack detection capabilities is also much better than best than historical. So to combine to check the performance against Presta, what we did was we tuned the performance of Presta to have the same attack detection capability as that of BLAG. So they have the same exact recall. And we measured the change in specificity. And what we observed is that Presta has very low specificity of 82% when you actually compare it to that of BLAG, which has 95%. You can look into our paper for other evaluations on the other two data sets of which basically include a DDoS and to a university network and a DDoS to a root DNS server. And we also explored other types of expansion techniques. Over here, I presented only the expansion technique of /24, but we do look into BGP prefix expansion or even expansion by autonomous systems. And we also look into a bunch of sensitivity analysis where we try to change the number of block lists which are given to BLAG. And we also play around with the size of the misclassification block list to see whether the performance gets affected or not. Okay, so this brings the end of the first part of my talk, where I spoke about BLAG. Now, I'll move on to the next part of the talk, which is presented at IMC, where we propose two techniques to identify reused addresses. So let's look into the first technique of identifying natted reused addresses. So in this technique, we make use of the BitTorrent network to identify users who have been allocated the same IP address at the same time. So BitTorrent is commonly used by users who are looking for content, and it basically connects users who have that particular content. Now, to enable this this particular network, the BitTorrent protocol has a bunch of messages which allows many users to communicate. Now, we'll make use of two of these messages to identify natted addresses, and these two messages are get notes and BitTorrent ping messages. So let's see how we use these messages. So in this example, we actually see that there are 5 users because there are 5 different port numbers which have been allocated to 3 different IP addresses. Now, the crawler is able to determine this by using the get nodes message, where it pretty much sends this message to identify users who are using BitTorrent. Now, in this case, we get two IP addresses that are being allocated to different users who may be potentially be using the same IP address at the same time. But this need not be the case for all the IP addresses, because some users may actually turn off their computer, and because of which, I mean, some users may actually reboot their computers, because of which they may be allocated a new port number. And this update of port number wouldn't have updated in the entire BitTorrent network. So the BitTorrent network can have stale information. So in order to verify if the same IP address is used by multiple users, what the crawler does is that it uses the BitTorrent ping message to verify if they are active at that particular point or not. So in this example, the crawler sends two BitTorrent ping messages to IP1 and IP2, for one for each port, and waits for the response. And we see that the crawler gets only one reply from IP1, indicating that there's only one active user for that particular IP address, and gets two replies from IP2, potentially saying that there are two active BitTorrent users who are using the same IP address at the same time. So the crawler actually identifies IP2 as a NATed address. So during our measurement period, we actually discovered about 48 million IP addresses that use BitTorrent. We sent about 1.6 billion BitTorrent ping messages, and out of which we got response from about 48% of them. And using our technique, we identified 2 million IP addresses that are NATed. So let's go to the second technique of identifying dynamic addresses. For this, we use a RIPE Atlas measurement framework, which basically consists of volunteers who have the RIPE Atlas probe installed in their network. And typically, these probes conduct small measurement tasks for researchers around the world. Now, each RIPE Atlas probe is allocated with a unique ID, and the RIPE Atlas probe constantly communicates with the central infrastructure to update the IP address which has been allocated to them. So we see that in this example, the RIPE Atlas probe ID has been allocated an IP address of IP4 over time T1, T2, and T3. So we use these measurement logs to determine if the RIPE Atlas probe is present in a dynamically allocated region or not. Now, if you actually observe this log for an extended duration of time, what you could actually see is that all the IP addresses that have been allocated to the particular ID. And here we see that this particular RIPE Atlas probe has been allocated an IP of IP4 and IP6 at time T3 and T4. So what we do is that we work on this log to determine probes that are in dynamically allocated regions. Now, we need to be very careful in choosing these probes because not all probes that have address changes are in dynamically allocated address spaces. So a typical example is that these volunteers may change their ISPs, and because of which they may be allocated a new IP address. So to prevent that, we consider probes that have address changes only within the same autonomous system. So starting off at around 15,000 RIPE Atlas probe, after we apply this filter, we are left with only 13,000 probes. Then we only consider RIPE Atlas probes that frequently change their addresses. Now, if you look into this graph, the x-axis shows all the probes, and the y-axis shows the total number of addresses that are being allocated during the monitoring period. We estimate the knee of the graph to determine probes which actually change their addresses very, very frequently. And the knee points to about 8 addresses. So once we apply this filter, we are only left with around 2,600 RIPE Atlas probe. Finally, we want to consider those RIPE Atlas probes that change their addresses on a daily basis. This is because these particular address spaces would have the maximum impact of blocklisting because they would be allocated to many more users over time than RIPE Atlas probes that change, say, probably over on a weekly basis. So when we actually apply this filter, we're only left with about 629 RIPE Atlas probes, starting all the way from 15,000 probes. So in order to determine the IP addresses that are reused and are listed in Blocklist, we use the same Blocklist data set which I described earlier. And this monitoring was done over two phases. One was done late last year, and the second one was done early this year. And we observed about 2.2 million blocklisted IP addresses in both these periods. So what we did was that we took these IP addresses that were listed in blocklist, and we take the IP addresses that were identified to be reused and took the intersection of them to see blocklisted reused addresses. So using our technique of the BitTorrent crawler, we identified about 30,000 IP addresses that are natted and are also present in blocklists. And using our dynamic address detection, we detected about 22,000 IP addresses that are blocklisted and are dynamically allocated. So let's look into some interesting results, and we'll try to answer three main questions. The first question is that how many blocklists actually list reused addresses? So the graphs on the left and right show the reused addresses that are natted and dynamically allocated present in blocklists. The x-axis shows the number of blocklists and the y-axis shows the number of addresses listed in them. So we find that about 61 blocklists and 72 blocklists do not have any natted reused address or dynamically allocated reused address. I just want to point out a caveat here is that our technique is not perfect. So we would not be identifying all the IP addresses that are reused. So we are definitely going to miss out many of the IP addresses. Then we also find that about the top 10 blocklists by size contribute to nearly about 65% of the natted reused addresses and 72% of all the dynamically allocated reused addresses. Finally, we were able to replicate only one of the study, which is publicly available, and we find that our technique is comparable to their technique in identifying the number of reused addresses. The second question we attempt to ask is that how long are these reused addresses present in blocklists? This is particularly important because if reused addresses are present in blocklists for a long time, then what could happen is that they could be unjustly blocked for that particular amount of time. So we find that reused addresses are indeed removed much faster than other addresses. So on average, reused addresses are removed 3 to 9 days when you compare it to normal blocklisted addresses that are removed within 11 days. So the graph on the left shows the number of days the IP addresses are present, reused IP addresses are present in blocklist, and the y-axis shows the CDF. Now, one interesting observation is that among the reused addresses, we find that dynamically allocated reused addresses are removed much quicker. So within 2 days, about 77% of all the dynamically allocated reused addresses are removed, well, compared to only 42% of the remaining blocklisted addresses. Finally, we want to identify how many users would be potentially affected if these reused addresses are used to block directly. Now, the graph on the left shows the total number of users who are using the same IP address, and the y-axis shows the CDF of all the IP addresses. Note that this is done only for the natted reused address because our crawler is able to identify the total number of active users behind each IP address, and it's not applicable for the dynamically allocated addresses. Now, in the worst case, we find that some IP addresses listed in blocklist could potentially block as many as 78 users. And many of times, these IP addresses block only 2 active users. And we also find that about 98% of these IP addresses have less than 10 active users behind them. So in summary, we find that blocklists have poor attack detection. So in order to improve this, we thought of combining blocklists of different attack types and historically include all the IP addresses listed in these blocklists. However, we find that by aggregating naively, you could actually have a lot of misclassifications. So we propose BLAG, which assigns relevance scores to addresses that are being listed in blocklists. Then we use a recommendation system to prune out these potential misclassifications. And finally, to make blocklists more proactive, we selectively identify addresses and expand them to their /24 prefix. The second part of the study consists of identifying reused addresses in blocklists. And we find that because of the IPv4 address shortage, many of the IP addresses listed in blocklists tend to block more number of users than required. So we proposed two new techniques for identifying views addresses in Blocklist. The first technique uses a BitTorrent crawler to identify active users. And the second technique uses a RIPE Atlas measurement logs to identify dynamically allocated address spaces. So this concludes my talk, and I'm ready to take some questions. But before that, all the data sets which I spoke during this talk is publicly available. You could go ahead and test out BLAG if you like. And we're constantly monitoring the blocklist too. So every day we update a snapshot of blocklist on our website, and we have historical blocklist data since 2016. And I hope it'll be useful to some of you guys. Thank you. Okay, so I'm up for questions if there's any. Okay, so the question from Drew is that where do you think these hyper-accurate block lists have the highest impact? Yeah, so a part of, so yeah, you could actually, so this could be partly answered. So in the second paper, we actually conducted a survey among network operators to actually see if block lists have any impact on the network or they are being actually used. So we find that many of these users or network operators use these block lists to actively block traffic. So they use, say, very popular block lists such as Spamhaus or Alien Wall to block traffic actively. So I think that block lists, typically the ones which have a large number of IP addresses listed in them, tend to have a larger impact of detecting attackers. However, it should be noted that since they're very large, they also have a lot of use resistance in them. So effectively, if you're blocking these IP addresses altogether, you may be blocking more number of users than required. So yeah, again, I would encourage you to read our papers where we compare the impact in terms of the size of block lists, and you will see how the performance actually varies.
Great, thanks. I see another question here. Were you able to get API access from Mailinator free, or did you need grant money to help fund the portion?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So I tried to reach out to them, and they were unwilling to share with us. So we had to pay for a month. So it's not that expensive. It's about, I think the last time I checked, it was about $100 for a month, and they don't have any caps. So essentially, we harvested about nearly 3 million emails, and we were able to identify nearly 35,000 or 50,000 IP addresses that actually send spam. So I think it's worthwhile getting the API access if you're into that type of study.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. No, he answered the question. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, that's pretty lame, but that's cool that you're able to actually be able to do the research. So I figured that'd be more of an undertaking. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, I would like to thank you guys for taking your time for attending the talk. Yeah, and Mike, I would definitely send these slides over so that you could share it with the group.
Okay.
Great. Thanks.
So thank you for your presentation, and thank you to all the students that were attending.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.